I'm Chance Storland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. A jury has found a 19-year-old San Antonio man guilty of capital murder in a home invasion case, and I'm joined now by my weekly guest, San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala, to get the details. Elizabeth, let's start with who this teenager is and then move into the home invasion itself that unfortunately led to the death of one of its inhabitants.
Yes, it's good to be back with you, Chance. This was a really interesting case, specifically because we have a situation where there was a very beloved Universal City physician assistant by the name of Michael Clayton Robinson, who was at home with his wife and two of his 6 children the night of October 10th, 2017. And they were awakened by a noise. And when Mrs. Robinson looked outside the window, she saw that there was a car in their driveway and she heard some sounds. She woke up her husband, who grabbed his 9mm Glock and approached their bedroom door and yelled the words, "Get out of my house." And at that moment, the door came open and these two men shot each other. Mr. Robinson, who was affectionately known as Clay by his family and by friends, was shot twice, and he also shot Jonathan Perales, who was barely 18 years old when this happened, Chance. So what ended up happening was this neighborhood in the 8400 block of Ulysses Drive had people calling 911 that night. You had people in the Robinson home who had just been robbed and had just experienced this, tragic event in their house, calling 911 to get EMS to the house. And then you have a situation where the teenager had run out of the house and had tried to get into his car to leave the scene. And what ended up happening, Chance, was he got lost in the subdivision. And he drove around and actually ended up in front of the house of the neighbor of the man that he had just shot. He was in the yard, and the neighbor who testified at the trial said that he didn't know what was going on. All he knew that there was somebody shot in his front yard, and he felt like he needed to get him to safety, so he brought him inside the house. And it was quite the scene that the jury here in Bexar County saw based on body camera video that was taken from Universal City officers that night when they arrived at the neighbor's house and saw Jonathan Perales, 18 years old, writhing on the ground, begging police officers to get him some medical care because he thought he was going to die. And at that moment, he began saying things like, "I'll tell you whatever you want." He said, "Bro, I'm dying, bro. Dude, I'm dying. Get me some help." And he said, "I'll tell you anything you want." He says, "He shot me and I shot him." So basically he admitted to police right there on the scene, who read him his rights as they're waiting for an ambulance to come. He admitted that he shot the homeowner. So when the trial started on Tuesday in the 290th State District Court before Judge Melissa Skinner, jurors heard the defendant at the time plead not guilty. He maintains that he was high on Xanax that night and was driving around because he wanted, some money. He wanted to find valuables that he could maybe sell, and it just basically wanted to get money. So when he found this house, he went around it and realized that the back gate was unlocked, and then so was the back door. So he was going in and out of this house, and he took a guitar, he took a backpack, purses, and he actually took all of the keys to every vehicle that was at that house. So he had filled up his trunk, and he went into the house a third time. And at that moment, he told the jury that he heard an authoritative male voice say, "Get out of my house." So when he's testifying, he's saying that it was really dark in there. I couldn't see anything. And when he, saw the door open or felt the door open, he said, "I got shot, so I shot back." But testimony was established by witnesses, including Clay Robinson's wife, Debbie, that her husband had a flashlight. Apparently, the convicted killer now, we can call him Jonathan Perales, also had a flashlight. So there were a lot of details in the court, which, one could say made it so that the jury, was able to come to their conclusion, in 3 hours of deliberations in this case. So I want to tell you a little bit about Clay Robinson. He was 51 years old. He was very involved in his church, and he went on camping trips with teenagers as part of, church activity. And he was also a physician assistant. And in the days after his death, there were tributes that were placed on his Facebook page. Some of my colleagues here at mysanantonio.com who wrote about this murder after it happened had, a lot of good details about how beloved Mr. Robinson was. And it became so much clearer in after Judge Skinner read the guilty verdict, when 2 of his 6 children gave their victim impact statements before Jonathan Perales was led away to serve life in prison. And just so that just so that you know, and our listeners know, this was a capital murder case, but the Bexar County District Attorney's Office did not seek the death penalty. So in those instances, Chance, when you have a capital murder, other felony case where you're not seeking death, the jury doesn't have to begin a punishment phase. So Perales automatically was sentenced to life in prison, and there is no possibility for parole. So he's 19 years old, and he's going to die behind bars. So after he was led away, one of Mr. Robinson's children, his daughter Catherine, very eloquently and emotionally, faced her father's killer and told him, what it was like for her, because, she got married and didn't have her dad to walk her down the aisle. She talked about that and talked about how her father was one of her favorite people, and really brought the point home that her mother no longer has her husband. She and her siblings no longer have a father, and their grandparents no longer have a son. And another member of the family, Clay Robinson's son, Aaron Robinson, told, and this was probably one of the most emotional things in court, as the mother and other relatives of Jonathan Perales wept in court, Aaron Robinson talked about how faithful the family was with their church, and that because they are so faithful and that they have a very strong faith in God, Aaron Robinson told Perales that because of those things, that was how he and his family were able to get to the point to where they were able, to forgive. And he stood and looked at his father killer and said these words, and I quote, "One day, just as my father did on October 10th, 2017, and that's really significant. I'm going to interrupt my quote a little bit. That's significant because October 10th last year was the day that Clay Robinson was killed. And we are a year out from this. And today is the 11th of October. And his killer is now behind bars and is going to die in prison. So he said, one day, just as my father did on October 10th, 2017, we are going to have to stand before God. And Aaron Robinson continued, when you stand before him, you're going to have to respond to your choices. So there was, you could have heard a pin drop in court, with the exception of the tears that flowed from the family of the Perales family, rather, and then the large number of friends and family that attended this 4-day trial in the 290th. There was just hardly any place to sit. But there were so many details during this trial that came out that were pretty startling. And in closing arguments, prosecutors Christina Escalona and Rose Zabel pointed out that Jonathan Perales tried, and he testified, Chance, he tried to tell the jury that, according to the prosecutors, that he was a victim here. And it just didn't work with the jury because so many different things were brought out. Specifically, the prosecutors displayed photographs of the defendant that actually had been placed up on the day that Clay Robinson was killed, or at least the day before, on the 9th of October, with Jonathan Perales holding a .38 Special revolver in his lap with a bunch of cash, and then another picture with that gun in front of his face, and he has his mouth open, and he's got what he has described on his Facebook post as Xanax bars on his tongue. And then probably the thing that this really was the most alarming in court was that sometime after the fatal shooting, and likely while Jonathan Perales was in jail, he got a tattoo. And this is a very large tattoo that has some cursive writing on it, but it has a revolver, 3 bars of Xanax drawn into it, and the acronym RIP, and then 10-10-17. And that, of course, represents, rest in peace, the day that Clay Robinson was killed. So there was, I would say that there was quite a bit of outrage on the faces of many of the people in the gallery. And again, just in the fact that it only took the jury a little under 3 hours to render this guilty verdict is telling. And defense attorneys, Jeff Mulliner and his wife, Kristen Mulliner, they argued eloquently the fact that this teen, and he's 19, so we can still call him a teen, was barely 18 when this happened. And Kristen told the jury that her oldest daughter is 19, and she basically told them, I can tell you right now that she's still a baby. And both sides discussed and agreed and presented to the judge, who allowed them to instruct the jury that they could consider a lesser charge of felony murder. But the jury didn't go for it. So the Mulliners pretty much argued that, he had ADHD, he was high on Xanax, and his age, he's just not, basically he's still a kid, they were trying to argue. And they felt like there were things, like criminal adoration and a, quote, thug life that somehow has become popular. And then you have social media that all of these things added together just, didn't look good for the defendant, but they implored the jury to make those considerations in regard to the verdict. But Chance, it's really kind of hard, I think, to do that when in this day and age, and especially here in Texas, prosecutor Christina Escalona argued Mr. Robinson was just trying to protect his family. And she also pointed out, back to that video that we discussed at the beginning of this program, that Jonathan Perales, writhing on the ground, was begging people to help him. But yet, across, next door, a man was dying, and the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office ruled, of course, the death a homicide, and Mr. Robinson was shot twice, or had two entry wounds in his body, and one of those to his abdomen on the side did so much damage inside Mr. Robinson's body that he basically bled out into his chest and abdomen. So he, likely was pronounced at the hospital, but he died quickly. So a very interesting case, a capital murder, non-death case, but again, a cautionary tale, especially for, teenagers who, like to maybe think that they are part of a thug life and try to live it that way. I will say that Jonathan Perales did not have any felony convictions before going into this trial. And it was very clear, one of the things that was pointed out here is, and it's actually a no-brainer for those of us who, have gray hair and are much older, but, social media matters. If you don't want something to be used at your criminal trial, you need to think twice before you post it. And there's so many of these photographs that, if you just go through Facebook sometimes and you see some of these, people like to put pictures. I've seen adult women with guns, holding a gun, and they're driving a car like a profile picture. And you just kind of wonder, man, one of these days that's going to come back and bite somebody. And, I will say that Mr. Jonathan Perales' social media profile did not do him any favors in his trial, because I think those images are going to be some that people are not going to forget, and certainly not the family of Michael Clayton Robinson, who again was a good man by all accounts from everyone who talked about him, and and Mr. Jonathan Perales is going to likely die in prison.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. So, obviously, Elizabeth, as you've mentioned a couple different times, a very interesting case. And I want to go back to this idea that Jonathan Perales could be considered a victim. That's a very interesting idea to have in a situation like this. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe he claimed that he only returned fire because he said he was shot at first. And so even if that is the case, after robbing someone's house, after entering someone's house, without permission, only to find that the people living in there were fighting back, and if you are to believe Jonathan Perales, firing first at you, is it even possible, in your opinion, to claim self-defense when you're in that position? I have to say, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, and you are not either. But just from a general understanding of how the law works, I don't think that could work out as an argument in a case like this.
No, in fact, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that basically is the point. I mean, you're in your house, you're asleep, and you're awakened by someone who has broken into your house. Even though the door was unlocked, he should not have gone into the house. He's filled up his trunk with things that do not belong to him. It was something that one of the prosecutors said, that of course he is going to defend his family. And actually, the moment that he yelled, "Get out of my house," he was giving Perales the opportunity to get out, because Mr. Robinson had a gun as well. But yes, he was very much within his right to shoot the man that broke into his house. So yeah, I mean, I think that, that is something that a jury is not going to let slide, certainly not in the state of Texas. You know what I mean?
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Docket Podcast. Elizabeth, thanks as always for joining me. A very interesting case, but I think that you pointed out very well with a lot of detail just how much this affected the family, who has now lost a family member, and the community, who's lost a very valued member of the community. And then finally, the convicted person in this case now, barely 18 when the home invasion occurred, now 19, going to spend the rest of his life in jail. So a sad case all around, but I'm really glad that we were able to talk about it today. And of course, thank you for joining me, Elizabeth. We'll have you back on the podcast next week.
Thank you, Chance. Take care.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News Courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket Podcast, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio and Bexar County from expressnews.com. Brought to you by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.